The forgotten war that even Stalin refused to remember. Picture this. The year is 1939, and the world's most powerful dictator Joseph Stalin orders nearly 1 million soldiers to invade a nation with barely 3.7 million people. What should have been a swift conquest turned into the most humiliating military disaster in Soviet history. So embarrassing, in fact, that Stalin tried to erase it from the history books entirely. This is the story of the Winter War, a conflict so devastating to Stalin's reputation that he banned Soviet newspapers from covering it, purged generals who dared speak of it, and spent decades pretending it never happened. Yet this forgotten war would change the course of World War II and reveal a truth that would shake the foundations of the Soviet Empire. I'm about to take you on a journey into one of history's most deliberately buried secrets, a war where frozen corpses stacked like cordwood, where a single Finnish sniper killed over 500 Soviet soldiers, and where the mighty Red Army was brought to its knees by farmers on skis. This isn't just another World War II story, this is the war that exposed the Soviet Union's greatest weakness at its moment of supposed strength. But before we dive deeper into this incredible tale, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. We're uncovering the stories that powerful people tried to hide, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The seeds of this forgotten war were planted in a secret room in Moscow. On August 23, 1939, Stalin sat across from Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, signing what the world knew as a non-aggression pact. But hidden within that document was a secret protocol that would seal Finland's fate. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact didn't just promise peace between Hitler and Stalin, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence like pieces on a chessboard. Finland, along with the Baltic states, was handed to Stalin. Hitler essentially gave his blessing for the Soviet Union to swallow these small nations whole. For Stalin, this wasn't just about territory, it was about creating a buffer zone around Leningrad, his second most important city, which sat dangerously close to the Finnish border. What Stalin didn't anticipate was that the Finns had no intention of becoming another Soviet puppet state. When Soviet negotiators demanded massive territorial concessions in October 1939, including key islands and military bases, Finland's leaders refused. They had seen what happened to the Baltic states, how mutual assistance pacts with the Soviets led to occupation and the disappearance of independence. The Finnish rejection infuriated Stalin. Here was a nation smaller than most Soviet provinces, daring to defy the master of the Kremlin. In Stalin's mind, Finland's resistance wasn't just political opposition, it was a personal insult that demanded crushing retaliation. On November 26, 1939, Stalin's patience ran out. Soviet artillery opened fire on the border village of Mainila, killing several of their own soldiers. Within hours, Moscow blamed Finland for the unprovoked attack, and declared that Finnish aggression left the Soviet Union no choice but to defend itself. It was a lie, so blatant that even Stalin's own generals later admitted it was fabricated. But the lie served its purpose. On November 30, 1939, over 600,000 Soviet troops, 2,000 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft crossed the Finnish border. Stalin confidently predicted the war would be over in 2 weeks. Soviet newspapers were already preparing stories about the liberation of the Finnish people from their capitalist oppressors. What happened next defied every military expert's prediction. The Finnish army, outnumbered 3-1 in men and 30-1 in tanks, didn't collapse. Instead, they fought with a ferocity that stunned the world. Finnish soldiers, many of whom were farmers and lumberjacks just days before, turned the frozen wilderness into a death trap for the advancing Soviets. The Red Army, despite its overwhelming numbers, was catastrophically unprepared. Most Soviet soldiers had never experienced temperatures below -20°C. Their equipment froze, their vehicles broke down, and their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across hostile terrain. Finnish forces, moving silently on skis and wearing white winter camouflage, struck Soviet columns and vanished like ghosts. The most devastating tactics came to be known as Marty warfare, the Finnish term for encirclement. Small mobile Finnish units would attack the head and tail of Soviet columns, trapping thousands of soldiers in the wilderness without food or ammunition. Entire Soviet divisions simply disappeared into the white hell of the Finnish forest, their frozen corpses discovered only when the snow melted months later. One Soviet general, writing in his diary, described scenes that haunted him for the rest of his life. The road was littered with bodies, weapons, and equipment. Men froze to death standing up, still holding their rifles. I have never seen such carnage. These diary entries would remain classified in Soviet archives for over 50 years. But perhaps no individual embodied Finnish resistance more than Simo He, a quiet farmer turned sniper who became known as the White Death, operating in temperatures that reached -40°. He used an old Finnish rifle without even a telescopic sight. He would lie motionless for hours in the snow, his breath creating no visible vapor because he packed his mouth with snow to hide his position. In just 100 days, he'd killed over 500 Soviet soldiers, an average of 5 per day. His methods were terrifyingly simple. He studied Soviet patrol patterns, positioned himself along their routes, and fired single, precise shots before melting back into the forest. Soviet forces launched artillery barrages and sent entire companies to hunt him, but he seemed to vanish like smoke. The psychological impact of snipers like he was devastating. Soviet soldiers began to fear every tree, every snowdrift, every shadow. They moved in constant terror, knowing that death could come from any direction without warning. Military reports describe Soviet troops suffering from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, refusing to leave their bunkers and breaking down under the constant stress. Meanwhile, international support for Finland surprised everyone, including Stalin. Britain and France, despite being at war with Germany, began shipping weapons and supplies to Finland. Volunteers from across Scandinavia joined the Finnish army. American public opinion overwhelmingly supported the Finns, with President Roosevelt calling the Soviet invasion a moral outrage. But Stalin was learning, adapting, and most importantly, getting angry. The man who had purged his own military leadership just 2 years earlier now faced the humiliation of his invincible Red Army being defeated by what Soviet propaganda called a handful of bourgeois bandits. Foreign newspapers were calling it David versus Goliath, and David was winning. The dictator's response was typically brutal. General Pavel Rychagov, commander of Soviet air forces, made the mistake of complaining that his pilots were being sent to die in obsolete aircraft. Stalin had him arrested and shot. Any officer who retreated without permission was executed on the spot. Those who spoke honestly about the military situation were branded as traitors and disappeared into the gulags. By January 1940, Stalin realized that his quick victory had become a prolonged nightmare. The Red Army had suffered over 126,000 casualties, more than they would lose in some entire World War II campaigns. International prestige was crumbling, and Hitler was taking notes about Soviet military weaknesses. Most dangerously, the League of Nations had expelled the Soviet Union and was considering military intervention to help Finland. Stalin's solution was characteristic of his approach to every problem. Overwhelming force, he appointed Semyon Timoshenko, one of his most ruthless generals, to command a reorganized offensive. Fresh divisions poured in from across the Soviet Union. The second phase of the Winter War would be different. No more individual initiative. No more tactical flexibility. Just raw, crushing power applied without regard for casualties. The renewed Soviet offensive in February 1940 was devastating in its scale. Over 1 million shells fell on Finnish positions in a single day. The small Finnish army, exhausted after months of fighting, began to crumble under the relentless bombardment. Their ammunition was running low, their reserves were depleted, and international aid was proving insufficient. Finnish Commander Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, a veteran of both Russian and Finnish armies, faced an impossible situation. His country was being systematically destroyed, and his forces couldn't hold out much longer against unlimited Soviet resources. On March 12, 1940, Finland signed the Treaty of Moscow, ceding 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union. But Stalin's victory came at a price that would haunt him for years. The Red Army had suffered nearly 400,000 casualties fighting a nation with fewer people than most Soviet cities. Military equipment losses were staggering: over 1,200 tanks destroyed, hundreds of aircraft shot down, and thousands of vehicles abandoned in the snow. The human cost was even higher. Entire Soviet villages mourned sons who had frozen to death in the Finnish wilderness. More importantly, the Winter War had revealed fatal flaws in the Soviet military system. The purges of 1937–1938 had decimated experienced officers, leaving the Red Army led by political appointees who prioritized loyalty over competence. Soviet soldiers lacked proper winter equipment, training, and leadership. The entire military hierarchy was paralyzed by fear of making decisions without Stalin's approval. Adolf Hitler was paying attention. German military observers had watched the Winter War carefully, noting every Soviet weakness and tactical failure. When Hitler began planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, he referenced the Winter War as evidence that the Red Army was a paper tiger that would collapse under German pressure. "We have only to kick in the door," Hitler told his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The disastrous performance in Finland convinced Nazi leadership that they could defeat the Soviet Union in a matter of months. In this sense, the Winter War almost directly caused the German invasion of 1941 that would kill 27 million Soviet citizens. But Stalin learned from his humiliation. The military reforms that followed the Winter War transformed the Red Army into the force that would eventually reach Berlin. New equipment was developed, officers were better trained, and tactics were modernized. The lessons paid in Finnish blood would prove crucial when Hitler's armies invaded just over a year later. However, Stalin was determined to erase the Winter War from history. Soviet newspapers were forbidden from mentioning Finnish resistance or Soviet casualties. History textbooks described a brief liberation of Finnish territory with minimal Soviet losses. Veterans were warned never to discuss their experiences, and many were transferred to remote postings where their stories couldn't spread. The cover-up went beyond simple censorship. Stalin ordered the destruction of military records, the reassignment of officers who had witnessed the disaster, and the creation of entirely fictional accounts of Soviet success. For decades, most Soviet citizens knew nothing about the true cost of the Winter War. It became the conflict that officially never happened. Even today, many people have never heard of this war that shaped European history. While we remember D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and Stalingrad, the Winter War remains buried in historical footnotes. Yet this forgotten conflict changed everything. It convinced Hitler that he could defeat Stalin. It forced military reforms that saved the Soviet Union. And it proved that small nations could resist superpowers if they fought with courage and intelligence. The Finnish soldiers who faced Stalin's war machine understood something profound about human nature. They knew they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. They knew their chances of victory were almost zero, but they also knew that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Their resistance wasn't about military strategy, it was about the fundamental right of people to determine their own destiny. Simo He, the sniper who terrorized Soviet forces, survived the war despite taking shrapnel to his face that disfigured him for life. He returned to his farm and lived quietly until his death in 2002, rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. When asked about killing so many enemy soldiers, he simply said, "I did what I had to do, and I did it as well as I could." That quiet determination defined Finland's entire war effort. They didn't fight because they expected to, when they fought because surrender meant the end of everything they valued. Every Finnish family had stories of Russian occupation, of relatives who had disappeared into Siberian labor camps, of freedoms lost forever. The Winter War wasn't just about territory, it was about survival as a free people. The strategic implications extended far beyond Finland's borders. Stalin's failure convinced not only Hitler, but also Japan and other potential enemies that the Soviet Union was vulnerable. The Japanese began planning attacks on Soviet territory in the Far East. Even Britain and France considered opening a second front against the Soviets while they were still fighting Germany. Perhaps most importantly, the Winter War revealed the fundamental contradiction in Stalin's system. He had created a military that was powerful on paper but crippled by fear, political interference, and incompetent leadership. Soldiers were afraid to show initiative because independent thinking was punished. Officers prioritized political loyalty over military effectiveness. The entire system was optimized for internal control rather than external warfare. This wasn't just a military problem, it was a symptom of Stalin's entire approach to governance. The same paranoia that led to the purges also created a military incapable of adapting to unexpected challenges. The same centralized control that maintained Stalin's power also prevented effective decision-making on the battlefield. The Winter War proved that totalitarian systems, despite their apparent strength, often collapse when faced with determined opposition. The human stories from this war are what make it truly unforgettable. There was Arne Juutalainen, a Finnish pilot who shot down 34 Soviet aircraft despite flying an obsolete fighter plane. There was Lauri Turney, who led special forces units behind Soviet lines and later fought for 3 different armies in 3 different wars. There was Tabe Slyer, a 15-year-old volunteer who carried ammunition to Finnish positions under constant artillery bombardment. These weren't professional soldiers or military heroes in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to fight for something bigger than themselves. Their stories remind us that history's greatest moments often come from the most unexpected sources. But the Winter War also reveals the terrible cost of dictatorial ambition. Stalin's decision to invade Finland wasn't based on legitimate security concerns or popular demand. It was the product of one man's ego, paranoia, and desire for control. Hundreds of thousands of people died because Stalin couldn't tolerate the existence of an independent neighbor. The families of Soviet soldiers paid the highest price. They received telegrams informing them that their sons had died defending the motherland, without any explanation of where, when, or why. Many bodies were never recovered from the frozen forests of Finland. Entire villages lost their young men to a war that officially didn't exist and for reasons that were never explained. This pattern would repeat throughout Stalin's reign and continue under his successors. The invasion of Hungary in 1956, the crushing of Prague Spring in 1968, the Afghan War that lasted a decade all followed the same template established in Finland. Small nations asserting their independence faced overwhelming Soviet force, and the human cost was always higher than anticipated. The suppression of the Winter War's history also demonstrates how effectively totalitarian regimes can control information. For 50 years, most of the world forgot about this conflict. It took the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of archives to reveal the full scope of the disaster. Even now, Many details remain classified or lost forever. This should concern us in our current information age. If Stalin could erase a major war from public memory using primitive communication technology, what could modern authoritarian regimes accomplish with digital tools? The Winter War reminds us that historical truth requires constant vigilance and protection from those who would rewrite it for political purposes. The geographic legacy of the Winter War still shapes European politics today. The territory Finland lost, including the city of Viboria and significant portions of Karelia, remains part of Russia. Over 400,000 Finnish civilians were forced to abandon their homes, creating a refugee crisis that took decades to resolve. The psychological scars of the war influenced Finnish foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Finland's solution was Finlandization, a policy of careful neutrality that avoided provoking Soviet anger while maintaining internal independence. This required extraordinary diplomatic skill and constant awareness of Soviet sensitivities. Finland became a bridge between East and West, hosting superpower summits and facilitating communication during the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The military lessons of the Winter War extended far beyond Finland's borders. The effectiveness of mobile defense, winter warfare, and guerrilla tactics influenced military thinking worldwide. The Israeli Defense Forces studied Finnish techniques for fighting superior numbers. Vietnamese forces applied similar principles against American troops decades later. Even today, military academies teach the Winter War as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the power of national will. Finland survived because its people believed their independence was worth any sacrifice. They weren't fighting for conquest or ideology. They were fighting for the right to exist as a free nation. That clarity of purpose gave them strength that no amount of Soviet equipment could overcome. The Winter War also highlights the unpredictable nature of historical momentum. Stalin's decision to invade Finland seemed logical from his perspective, a quick victory that would secure his borders and demonstrate Soviet power. Instead, it set in motion a chain of events that nearly destroyed his empire. Hitler's invasion, motivated partly by observed Soviet weakness, cost more Soviet lives than any other conflict in human history. This reminds us that actions have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate context. Every decision by political leaders, especially those involving military force, creates ripple effects that can last generations. The families torn apart by the Winter War, the cities destroyed, the trust broken between nations. These costs echo through decades of European history. Today, as we watch conflicts around the world, the Winter War offers crucial insights into the dynamics of aggression and resistance. Small nations facing overwhelming odds can still maintain their independence if they're willing to pay the price. International support matters, but ultimately, freedom must be defended by those who value it most. And historical memory is itself a battlefield where truth competes with propaganda for future generations' understanding. The men who fought in the forests of Finland understood something that we sometimes forget in our comfortable modern world. Freedom isn't free, and independence isn't guaranteed. They were willing to die for principles that transcended their individual lives. Their sacrifice reminds us that the values we take for granted, self-determination, national sovereignty, the right to choose our own governments, have always been fragile and always required protection. So what do you think? Could a small nation today successfully resist a superpower invasion using the tactics that worked for Finland? Have we learned the right lessons from this forgotten war, or are we doomed to repeat similar mistakes? And why do you think it's so important for authoritarian regimes to control historical narratives about their failures? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage against impossible odds inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden chapters of history. Next week, we're diving into another story that powerful people tried to bury, the secret negotiations that could have prevented World War II entirely. You won't want to miss it. The Winter War may have been forgotten by design, but its lessons remain as relevant today as they were in 1939. In a world where small nations still face pressure from larger neighbors, where truth battles propaganda in the information war, and where individual courage can still change the course of history, the story of Finland's resistance offers both inspiration and warning. Remember it, share it, and never let the powerful erase the stories of those who stood up to them. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.